Welcome to part 3 of a 4-part lecture on qualitative interviewing with me, Victoria Clark. In this part, we're going to focus on and explore other possibilities for interviewing beyond the one-on-one, in-person, seated interview, and there's also going to be some opportunities for reflecting on practice. Please feel free to skip through the next few slides if you've already listened to one of the lectures from this project created by Virginia or Ginny Braun, pictured on the left, me, Victoria Clark, in the middle, and Nikki Hayfield on the right, from a project creating teaching and learning resources for qualitative methods online. So in this lecture on interviewing, we're going to explore different types of research interviews and identify when interviews would be a suitable form of data generation for particular research projects. That's part 1. In part 2, we explored good practice for designing an interview guide and to consider how to prepare for and get the most out of qualitative interviews. That was part 2. Part 1 also explored some of the advantages and disadvantages of interviews. And then in this part, we're going to explore some other possibilities for interview designs beyond conventional in-person, one-on-one seated interviews. And we're also going to provide some opportunities for reflecting on interview practice. And then in the final optional part 4, we're going to focus on transcription. So to give you a quick overview of the 4 parts of the lecture, in part 1, we explored the questions, what are qualitative interviews and will they be a good fit for my research? In part 2, we focused on designing interview guides and preparing for interviews. In this part, part 3, we're going to explore other possibilities for interviewing and reflecting on practice. And then in optional part 4, we'll focus on transcription. Historically, the most common way in which interviews have been conducted is in person and one-on-one, so one interviewer, one participant, and seated together in a quiet, private space. And this is typically thought of, or has been historically thought of, as the gold standard for interviewing. It's how you put participants at ease, it's how you develop a rapport because you're sat together, you're meeting in person. But since other technologies have become available, people have started to think differently about how we conduct interviews and started to question the idea that in-person one-on-one interviews, seated interviews are the gold standard. And there are now lots of different possibilities for interviews. The interviews can be written as well as spoken, that you can walk and talk rather than sit and talk, and interviews don't necessarily have to be one-on-one. So we're going to explore some of those other possibilities. And this is a bit of a whirlwind tour. We're not giving you an in-depth guide to different ways of doing interviews. We just want to signal what possibilities are out there to give you some food for thought for your research. So telephone interviews, other than in-person interviews, the oldest interview modality, they're now considered a type of virtual interview, but they've been around for a very, very long time. As soon as kind of telephone technology became widespread, researchers started using telephones for interviews. They can be a standalone method, or they can be offered as one of a choice of modalities in a single study. They're thought to be particularly suitable for busy participants and sensitive topics where the kind of social pressure of meeting someone kind of face to face is removed and there's a sort of greater sense of kind of anonymity. And there are different perspectives on telephone interviews, comparing them to what is seen as the gold standard of in-person interviews. So some people say they're kind of similar, they generate data of similar quality and quantity. Others have argued that the lack of kind of face-to-face cues may impact on the quality of data, that you don't get the body language and so on. I think it's worth bearing in mind with a lot of literature around different types of interviews that it's often speculative, that it's not based on empirical comparison. So people are kind of saying, oh, I don't think it works so well because you haven't got the body language, you haven't got access to those kind of cues. But you really need to do that kind of empirical research to look at the quality of the interviews, to look at the length of the interviews, to be able to draw meaningful conclusions. So one of my students, Marie Claire Fitzpatrick, she ended up using telephone interviews in research with women who'd experienced anorexia when raising their children. She didn't set out to just use telephone interviews. She decided that because this was a sensitive topic and she wanted the participants to feel as comfortable as possible, that she'd give them a choice of interview modality. So she offered in-person video call in the form of Skype and telephone interviews, and all participants, all 6, chose telephone interviews. So researchers started to experiment with Skype and other video call technology in the early kind of 2010s, but then the pandemic really accelerated things. So video call interviews have become ubiquitous, and they may be even as common or more common than in-person interviews. At UE, we have access to Teams for conducting video call interviews. Like telephone interviews, they're a synchronous method, so they're kind of happening in real time. And again, like telephone interviews, we can use them. All the interviews we do can be video call, or we can offer them to participants alongside other modalities. They're seen as particularly useful when participants are geographically dispersed, or where you don't have a budget for travelling to meet participants in person. Useful as well for busy participants, and they're thought to offer similar interactional advantages as in-person interviews, as well as various other practical benefits, because you can see people, so you have some of those body language cues. Others have argued that the technology creates an atmosphere and there are interactional losses. So they're seen as kind of pros and cons, but they become ubiquitous just because they're so practical, they're so straightforward, they're so easy to do. Another type of virtual interview, one that takes us away from spoken interviews and into written interviews, is email interviews. And these have been around for a while. And the benefits of email interviews are that they give participants a greater sense of anonymity, so they're not hearing a voice, or they're not seeing a face, or they're not sitting with someone in person. Like video call and telephone interviews, they're unconstrained by geography. They're also unconstrained by time zone differences if they're asynchronous. So you can be asking questions when you're awake during the day, and the participant can be answering them when you're asleep at night. They can be more accessible for some participants, obviously less accessible for others. And there's also no social pressure, no kind of visual cues, and people don't have to be coordinated to be in the same time and the same place. And obviously with written interviews, there's no transcription, so there's that very kind of practical benefit. They seem to be good for sensitive topics, again, having that greater sense of anonymity, and that they can be useful with hard to engage groups. And probably the primary benefit, and the one that's been discussed quite a bit in the literature, is that particularly when they're asynchronous, when you're not trying to do them in real time, there's time for reflection for both the participant and the researcher. So the participant has the opportunity to reflect on what they're sharing. They can go back and kind of edit and change their responses before they send them. And the researcher has time to kind of reflect on how they're responding. So that's aspect of email interviews is seen to be particularly beneficial. So they're particularly useful when you want to have a more kind of reflective mode of interviewing. So to give you an example, ISON used email interviews in research with young adults with verbal communication impairment. So you can imagine this is a population for whom spoken interviews can be quite challenging. And they talked about the fact that the stories of this group of young adults have all too frequently been left unheard or told by proxies, be told by other people who are able to kind of communicate without impairment verbally. So we can see how this different interview modality kind of opens up different possibilities and allows groups of people who are excluded from spoken interviews, gives them a way of taking part in interview research. Another virtual possibility, although there can be data protection issues with this modality, is instant messenger interviews. So you use something like WhatsApp, for example, or Facebook Messenger to kind of communicate with the participant. These can be synchronous, so they can be done in real time, or they can be asynchronous. As people have discussed in the literature, if they're synchronous, they can be very kind of fast and furious because you're typing and kind of things are kind of happening in real time. You can imagine that this type of interview works well for particular groups. So young people, for example, who are very used to kind of texting and messaging might feel more comfortable with this type of interview. So to give you an example, one of my students, Susie Anderson, who is researching people's lived experiences of problematic skin picking, decided that because this is a sensitive topic and that participants might feel uncomfortable being visible to the researcher, and because shame from the literature seems to be quite central to the experience of problematic skin picking, that she wanted to find a way to make the process of taking part as comfortable as possible for the participants. So she gave them a choice of modality. She offered them instant messenger interviews, email interviews, telephone interviews, Skype interviews, video feed or audio only, and in person if that was practical. And she offered all these different types because they offer varying degrees of anonymity. So an email can feel very anonymous, obviously in person, not anonymous, telephone kind of somewhere in the middle. And of the 17 participants who took part in the study, 12 chose instant messenger. So it shows that this type of interview modality kind of really resonated for this group of participants. 2 chose email, 2 chose telephone, and only 1 opted for in person, and that was done by Skype because they were too far away. Another study looking at a particular rare skin condition offered multiple modalities to participants as well. So giving participants the option of not being visible to the researcher. And again, lots of participants took the researcher up on that opportunity. So hopefully discussing these different modalities highlights the consideration of fitting the modality to the participant group and thinking about how you can meet the needs of the participant group. And this is quite a different way of thinking about interviewing than sort of seeing the in-person one-on-one interview as the gold standard and seeing virtual modalities as poor substitutes or things to do if you can't achieve the gold standard. It gives us a different way to think about interviewing, that we're trying to kind of meet the needs of the participants and make taking part as comfortable as possible and increasing the accessibility of the research to as many people as possible, rather than kind of fixating on one type of interviewing as the best. So this is the key message to take away from this part of the lecture, is to question the idea that in-person interviewing is the gold standard and to think instead about getting a good fit between the interview modality and the participant group, and that being the key to recruitment, making research more accessible to participants, and also the key to data quality. And there's been lots of interesting comparison studies that have used different interview modalities and have compared them and looked at the strengths and weaknesses of each. And that's generally the conclusion that people come to, that giving participants a choice in how they engage with the study means that more people are willing to take part, and it improves the quality of data because people feel more comfortable and they're more able to kind of participate in a way that works for them. And giving participants a choice of modality, giving participants some freedom in how they engage with research, is perfectly possible in qualitative research, and particularly non-positivist big Q qualitative research, because we're not typically concerned with kind of standardization of data generation. We're not concerned with kind of structured data generation. Instead, we can prioritize the needs and the comfort of participants. Obviously, we want to have some reflection on what different modalities kind of enable and limit, but we don't have the same concerns as our quantitative colleagues do with standardization. So all the different virtue modalities I've described will typically involve people seated and speaking or writing, but I want to talk about another possibility, what's known as walking and talking interviews or walk along or go along interviews. These started in urban planning and social geography research, so people concerned with kind of space, and they wanted to take participants out into that space and talk about that space. And so they started doing interviews kind of walking around the space. And people in other fields and disciplines have started to kind of pick up on the idea of walking and talking on mobile interviews. So there's now an interesting body of health research um, using this interview technique. And some researchers have used kind of bike along studies. Obviously, you need really good recording equipment. There's kind of dog walking interview studies. So there's all kinds of possibilities for getting out there in the world with participants that you don't need to kind of sit in a room um, to have a conversation with people. And again, it's worth thinking about the topic. When would this work really well? The participant group, who would this work for? And what researchers have concluded is that this kind of interview encounter can help prompt kind of deep and in-depth discussion. So if you have children, for example, and you think about you're having an awkward conversation, you often have those in the car when you're not kind of looking at each other, and that you're together in the same space, but that lack of kind of eye contact kind of removes pressure and makes those difficult conversations kind of easier. And the same can apply to kind of walking and talking. You're together, you're in the same space, but they're not necessarily sitting opposite each other, and kind of the direct eye contact can help people to kind of feel more comfortable. So lots of possibilities to explore if you kind of get out of the interview room and get out into the world. I also wanted to give a mention to focus groups. So these are a method that started in marketing and political research, but have since become well used kind of methods in academic and applied research. And focus groups refer to a relatively unstructured but guided group discussion with a moderator. So the moderator is the researcher. So in a focus group, rather than being an interview, you're a moderator. And you're a moderator because you're not just asking questions and the participants are just talking to you. You're there to facilitate a group discussion where participants talk to each other as well as kind of talk to you. There are in-person and there are virtual modalities. Focus groups took a bit longer to get virtual, but now there are all kinds of kind of possibilities for virtual focus groups. So obviously using video call technology, but people have used things like message boards for kind of asynchronous focus groups. And it's also possible to do focus groups without a moderator, so that you can set up the focus group and give participants instructions and kind of leave them to it. And there might be certain circumstances where that's a really good fit with the participant group or with the topic. And people who've done comparisons between self-moderating and research and moderated focus group have found that they can be quite different, that the things discussed can be quite different, the tone of the groups can be quite different. Focus groups are often used in combination with stimulus materials, so things to get people talking, and these can be images, videos, exercises, and they can both be icebreakers in the sense of kind of getting people comfortable with each other, particularly if you've got a group of strangers who don't know each other. But they can also be used to kind of focus the discussion, stimulate the discussion. And people might use focus groups if they want to get people's opinions on particular things. So they're used in health research, for example, where they want to explore people's perceptions of kind of patient information leaflets, for example. They can be open and supportive environments for discussing sensitive issues, and they can feel less intimidating than an interview. So, for example, one of my students, Rachel Graham, she was talking to African heritage women about how they managed distress, obviously quite a sensitive topic. And what she found is the kind of solidarity and the shared experience in the focus group made participants feel really comfortable and made them feel able to talk and share. And so focus groups, we might, at first sight, it might seem like, talking in front of other people might not be particularly comfortable, but they can take the pressure off. There's the kind of solidarity of shared experience that can help people to kind of open up and talk. And they're thought to some extent mimic how people kind of talk in real life. They're seen as more naturalistic than interviews because, we often have conversations with family and friends and so on, and they're getting close to those kind of group dialogues and allowing researchers more access to how people talk and the kind of language they use in their everyday lives, that people might feel less intimidated in a focus group setting and more able to open up. So, as a final other possibility, I wanted to talk about interviews being used in combination with other methods. So, as well as offering participants different types of modalities, a choice of modality, researchers also combine interviews with other methods. And I've got some examples from research that's been conducted by students here at UE. So the first example is of a student of mine, Xenia Bond, who used body mapping, which is a really fun drawing task. So you get participants to draw an outline of their actual bodies, and then you get them to kind of fill in the outline and construct a key that helps kind of decode the body map. And she used this method in research exploring therapists' perception of the body and use of embodiment in therapy. So she was initially just going to do interviews, and then we came across this method and we thought, well, if your research is focusing on embodiment, it makes sense to use an embodied method to kind of get closer to the body and the experience of the body. And I've included a couple of pictures of the participants' body maps. These are just to emphasize, these are from her publicly available thesis, so they're being shared with participants' kind of knowledge and consent. So this gives you a sense of one of the things that you can do in combination with interviews. And it was an amazing method and it worked incredibly well. And I think it gave access to kind of embodied experience in a way that it wouldn't have done with just a spoken interview. Another example is the combination of qualitative surveys, diaries and email interviews, and particularly diaries and email interviews. And this is another student of mine, Jessica Taylor, who was researching non-binary people's experiences of their bodies. So she did a big survey with lots of participants. Then she got a subset of the participants to complete a diary for several weeks where they reflected on when their bodies kind of came to mind. The diaries were incredible, really vivid, and really gave a sort of intense sense of what it was like to kind of live in a body kind of day to day over a particular period of time. And then she used email interviews to kind of explore more about people's experiences that they recorded in the diaries. So again, this very reflective type of interviewing to follow on from this kind of reflective mode of data generation. And again, that worked incredibly well. And the middle drawing on the right hand of the slide is one of Jessica's participants. They drew this in their diary. Another example, the hyperlinks will take you to the theses that are in the UE repository. There isn't a hyperlink for this one because it's a master's dissertation, but it was a music therapy student exploring the experiences of feminist creative arts therapists. And the student decided to do a focus group with the participants. And because they're creative arts therapists, decided to do a creative arts focus groups. So there were questions that people discussed, but they were also invited to bring things to the focus group, to bring art, to bring poetry. And there were also pauses in the focus group discussion where people either worked alone or together to create things, and then they shared and kind of talked about their creation. And again, that was it was a wonderful experience for the participants. They found it really positive, but it also stimulated really interesting discussion about what it means to be a feminist creative arts therapist. And I think that highlights something that's really important, is we often as researchers think about what we're trying to get from an encounter. We're trying to get data, and hopefully this discussion helps you to think about making it a really good experience for participants, making the experience of taking part in the research something that's valuable for them. And then finally, in a piece of research by Nikki Hayfield, exploring bisexual people's visual identities. Because her focus was on visual identities, she thought it was appropriate to use visual methods. So she used a technique called photo methods. And this is where you invite participants to either bring pictures or take pictures before the interview, and then they bring them to the interview and they provide a kind of stimulus for discussion. And there's lots of discussion of photo methods and lots of different ways of using photo methods. But this provides a really nice example of trying to get at something visual through the research and using a visual method to kind of facilitate that process. And again, in Nikki's thesis, she includes some of the anonymized pictures that people shared in the interviews. So that just gives you a flavor of some of the other possibilities, the ways that you can combine interviews with other methods. So we're going to end with 2 pauses for reflection. In the first one, we're going to present some extracts, and we'd like you to pause the recording on each slide and consider what issues you can identify in the researchers' reflections on their interviews, what impact these issues might have had on the interview and the data that was generated, what we might be able to learn from the interview experiences and their reflections on these experiences, and what they could have done differently to better manage the issue or avoid the issue. And we'll share our reflections on the slides following each extract. So here's the first extract from Rawson and colleagues reflecting on an interview experience. I'm not going to read it out. So if you'd like to participate in this activity, pause the recording and reflect on the questions on the previous slide. And the issue we think that extract usefully highlights is unanticipated occurrences. And we might experience all kinds of unanticipated situations when we're interviewing people. And these can occur when we're interviewing people in person and virtually, and it might be the participant being late, unexpected noise, people eating, inappropriate interview locations. I've had asthmatic Yorkshire Terrier sitting on a microphone, people not being there and forgetting, people being late, me being late and getting lost when going to meet people, children being in the room, all tellies being left on, lodgers being in the room, and so on. And so it's really good to kind of think through what could possibly go wrong and how you're going to manage it if these things happen. It sort of primes you to be ready to deal with the unanticipated and to have a thoughtful response to this rather than panicking or feeling distressed and so on, as the previous kind of reflection illustrated. This quotation is a bit shorter, so I will read it out. When she, the participant, saw me taking notes to remember those future probes, she stopped talking and I had to explain then what I was writing. So pause the recording and reflect on what issues you think this raises and how this could have been handled differently. And again, we think this relates to not fully preparing for the interview. So as well as not anticipating things that could go wrong, in this instance, the interview hasn't thought through what the participant needs to be informed about beforehand. So if you are going to take notes, it's really helpful to tell the participant that you're going to do that and why you're doing that. So to help me remember questions that I want to ask you, I might take some notes, but it doesn't mean that I'm not listening to you. That kind of anticipating how the participant might interpret or experience things and remembering to kind of explain things to them beforehand can be really helpful. So here's another extract. I won't read this one out, so pause the recording and have a reflect. And some final reflections. Again, these are on the longer side, so I won't read these ones out. So have pause the recording and reflect on the issues these raise. These extracts very nicely raise the issue of questioning and how we ask questions. So we ideally want to avoid leading questions because we want to find out what the participant thinks and feels rather than getting them to affirm what we think. There's also the issue of not probing enough, so just accepting what the participant says and moving on, and not exploring, not probing, not following up. There's also the issue of talking too much, so that the interview becomes more of a conversation between two people rather than an interview encounter where you're asking questions and encouraging the other person to talk. There's also the issue of letting the participant talk too much, not in the sense that they're giving really wonderful in-depth responses and you're cutting them off, but they're starting to diverge and go off track and talk about things that aren't related to the interview, and you're kind of losing control over the interview. And it's a real skill to kind of bring people back without sort of being impolite or rude, and kind of bringing them back to the focus. There's also the issue of asking long, rambling questions, and this can be very easy to do as an interviewer, particularly if you're feeling nervous or you're kind of struggling to kind of articulate what it is you want to ask. And also, as I said, being nervous about asking the question. And if you feel nervous and uncomfortable, that's what you can communicate to the participant, and they might feel in response. So it's important to try and feel relaxed and feel comfortable, and that will help the participant feel relaxed and feel comfortable. And here's our final pause for reflection, a really interesting paper exploring 3 different interviewers' interviewing style. And we've included it because we think it's really helpful to reflect on your own interview style. So we'll talk through the 3 different interviewers and their interviewing styles, and then we'd like you to reflect on what you think your interviewing style is. And this is in research with adolescents aged 12 to 19. So that's obviously quite important in terms of how the interviewers kind of pitch their style. So the first author, Annie, there were 3 keywords for her style: affirming, energetic, and interpretive. So affirming was defined in terms of her showing support for the participants' ideas. That's so cool. That's great. Oh, wow. That's amazing. Energetic was showing wonder, astonishment, or confusion by something the respondent said that was unexpected or remarkable. And you can tell the US researchers, that's neat, wow, how unique, that's really, really cool. And then interpretive, so expressing a personal opinion or interpretation regarding something a participant said. Oh my gosh, you must have felt terrible. Do you think that he drinks beer or does chew or smoke cigarettes? So that gives you a sense of Annie. And now here's Jonathan, and Jonathan is definitely who I identify with. So Jonathan's keywords were neutrality and naivety. So neutrality in terms of not engaging on one side of an argument or another, neither affirming nor disproving of respondent stories. Transcripts were characterized by shorter utterances, fewer opinionated responses, and very few exclamation marks. So we can often think of this in terms of a showing interest interviewing style. Okay, a sort of neutral sort of interest, but not empathy or enthusiasm or anything else. This is a really nice quotation. It was often difficult to see evidence of Jonathan's footprint in his transcripts because he maintained a fairly minimal presence in his interviews. And that's, I think, something that's kind of characteristic of my interview style that other people have often commented on, that I don't say a lot and I'm not very present in them. Another technique that he used, which I identify less with, is naivety. So showing a lack of knowledge or information about the respondent. I don't know. You've got to tell me these things, I'm learning. So kind of deliberately, strategically using naivety to get people to open up and share information. And then finally we have Michelle, and her keywords were affirmation and self-disclosure. So affirmation centered on encouragement and compliments towards respondents. My goodness, you're smart for a 7th grader, and it sounds like you're very helpful. And then self-disclosure, but not on her part, using stories of her adolescent son when she was explaining a topic that she wanted to discuss. I have a 14-year-old in 8th grade, and every Sunday night we do game night sort of thing, and I look forward to it. So what the researchers concluded was that for low-risk topics, all 3 styles generated sufficiently detailed responses. For moderate risk topics, affirmation set a tone of acceptance that was really helpful. But for high-risk topics, neutrality was the most effective. And they also reflected on the fact that their interviewing styles were probably rooted in traditional gender norms, with kind of Jonathan's kind of neutrality or interest is kind of reflecting something kind of more masculine, and Annie and Michelle taking a more kind of feminized approach to the interviewing. I think this is a really interesting paper. It's on Blackboard if you want to read it, and I'd invite you to reflect on whether you think you're Annie, Michelle, or Jonathan, or someone else. So there are lots of references for this part of the lecture. Here are your references. Slide 1, slide 2 of references, slide 3, slide 4, slide 5, and slide 6, and we'll leave it there.